Ralsei Deltarune, our favorite fluffed-up white boy with a penchant for hugs, a knack for healing, and a happy-go-lucky attitude that's so contagious he might actually fix her. Surely such a mumbly people-pleaser would crumble under the pressure of having his whole ideology questioned by his only friends. I'm telling them the truth. You can't make... Yeah, I kinda think I do. And I think that you're getting defensive because someone's daring to ask some proper goddamn questions around here. But joke's on you, bucko. I'm not in your silly little game, and my choices do matter. Ah! Yo, what up? Hi, I made it online. And if you think I sounded crazy just now, that's because I am. I've been moving for like the past week, but because Deltarune... tomorrow, I have to get this thing done, like, now. So I'm well aware that there's a bit of a stigma in Deltarune theory crafting circles around jumping to conclusions when it comes to Ralsei. And it's not even like I think my conclusions are any less jumped. Is that I think I found something a little more interesting than like a clear-cut conclusion. See, over the past few weeks, I've been poring over chapters 1 and 2 of Deltarune with the goal to completely, like, dissect Ralsei as a character. And while that process led me to my fair share of abstract speculation, it also led me to recognize that there's a far more interesting idea to explore when we take stock of what we don't know. Because as it turns out, we're able to be confident in a lot fewer things than you might expect. And when you take a step back and look at the puzzle pieces that Ralsei is missing, the empty space at the core of his character starts to look suspiciously heart-shaped. Before we get to any of those lofty claims, though, there's some legwork to be done, so it's time for me to drag you down the rabbit hole with me. Let's get to deconstructing, starting with the first moment that clued me into this whole train of thought. So, towards the end of Chapter 2, right after we've won against Big Queen, Noelle floats an idea that Susie's already been toying with for a hot minute now. These dark worlds are low-key sick nasty with it. Like, seriously, would it be so bad to just stay here? So Birdley asks around to make sure everyone's chill with the prospect before going to make another dark world, and... kinda snappy, huh? What with the whip sound effect and everything. It's almost condescending. Like, Birdley literally just asked if everyone was okay with it, so why didn't he say no then? Hell, he could have talked about it at any point across these first 2 chapters. So why, pray tell, would he keep the specifics to himself until the last moment? Maybe it's because he's conflict averse, but if he had mentioned the roaring just a little prior to this moment, the yelling would have been very preventable. So was Ralsei not telling us about the roaring on purpose? Okay, well, realistically, that was just a simple mistake. Like, yeah, he's hidden stuff from us before, but it's all pretty innocent, right? Obviously, there's the whole taking the hat off and revealing his actual color palette in Chapter 1, but as the resident anxious softboy, he very reasonably waves it away in the acid tunnel of love. It's a little odd when we're given no particular reason as to why he's insecure about being his true self, but insecurities are found in dug feelings, not logic. There's also how he doesn't tell us about Darkness turning to stone until after it happens to Lancer, though. Like, he starts to, but he never actually does. Again, weird, but still nothing incriminating. Oh, also, just before that, there's the part where he very clearly chooses not to let Susie know that all the Darkners from Chapter 1 only came back because Chris fetched a bunch of vaguely familiar inanimate objects from the unused classroom. There's also a bunch of subtle logical inconsistencies tucked within the things he tells us, like how none of the Darkners turn to stone while specifically in Castletown, how he doesn't turn to stone in any Dark World, and how he keeps just showing up without us having to fetch him. I don't know about you guys, but I don't see it as a pattern until it hits, like, double digits. Hey, what do you guys think ASRIEL's been studying in college? I think the thing that really seals the deal for me on this particular front, especially when put up next to the story of the Roaring, is the way that Ralsei reacts when Susie is trying to reflect on the Spamton neophyte. Because he insists to Susie that the things Spamton said didn't mean anything, and he insists to Chris that they shouldn't think about it, despite the fact that it was clearly making them upset. It does seem like a good-natured attempt to help us soothe our worries when we don't have anything else to go off of, but still, something about how he tells the both of us to not process what just happened feels like there's something going on here that he wants to stay hidden. And while based on just this, we have no reason to assume bad faith, I don't think it's too unfair of an assumption to say that there's some kind of ulterior motive here, that he can't tell us everything because broadly, it would cause problems. And it's this simple thought that gets a very dangerous snowball rolling that Ralsei could very well be an unreliable narrator. Stop. So I know we like to say that assuming makes an ass out of you and me, but theories are inherently speculative and assumptions come with the package. As such, I want to be as clear as possible about every assumption that I make such that you can judge for yourself how likely each individual thing is and even disagree with me wholeheartedly while still keeping up with me as a what-if exercise of sorts. So, okay, I want you to picture our knowledge of the Deltarune lore as a game of Jenga, where each block is a piece of our understanding, and each additional layer relies on all the layers below it to be true. Ideally, the things towards the bottom are things we have rock-solid evidence for, and conversely, the things towards the top rely the most on prior assumptions. This is what happens to our Jenga game if we make the first substantial assumption of this theory, that Ralsei could be an unreliable narrator, and in turn, choose not to take anything he tells us at face value.
Nice throw!
Like, okay, let me get into this, because it's actually genuinely kind of terrifying just how much lore people assume is implicit to Deltarune could straight up be false if it turns out that Ralsei has been lying to us. Because let me remind you, the two major exposition/lore cutscenes the game has given us so far, both the original legend and the story of the Roaring, weren't just cutscenes. Within the narrative context of the chapters, they are explicitly moments where Ralsei is diegetically telling these things to the characters around him. Okay, but shouldn't we be able to trust them if they're cutscenes? We will get there when we get there. But even so, the stories are still his. We've heard about the Roaring and the Titans from exactly one person, Ralsei. Our ultimate goal, banishing the Angel's Heaven, which supposedly comes courtesy of sealing the fountains, is with one exception something we've only heard of from Ralsei. And most importantly, not one character has mentioned the existence of a prophecy since we went through the Great Door. Like, the closest we've gotten is a number of Darkners commenting on us doing supposedly heroic things, and I'm pretty sure that every instance of that can be reasonably traced back to Lancer and Susie's bad guy antics spawning a bit of a rumor mill. Now, to be clear, this doesn't mean that Ralsei has to be wrong about any of this. Just because we don't have evidence that seems to properly prove that the prophecy is of this land like Ralsei says it is, doesn't mean that it can't be. With our own eyes, we've seen the fountains get opened and closed. We've watched inanimate objects turn into Darkners, and we've watched those Darkners turn to stone. But beyond that, we can also start to reassemble our Jenga tower by cross-referencing the things that he's told us with any other lore sources we've met on our silly little adventure. So who out there seems to be properly knowledgeable about the actual state of this world and can confirm at least some of what Ralsei is saying? Well, to start, there's our main pair of monarchs. King confirms that Darkners and Lightners used to live in quote-unquote harmony, with a couple caveats that Lightners abandoned the Darkners and that he's not big on the whole harmony solution anymore, so he's devoting himself to the night to screw us over. And that all seems fine and dandy, except for the fact that Ralsei's legend seems to imply that the harmony still exists. Then there's Queen, who talks about the roaring night that stabs the earth to make dark worlds, and who's dedicated her home theater to the fountain opening on loop. But as we later learn, after Ralsei tells the story of the roaring, she low-key didn't know shit, and was quite literally guessing based on the actions of the night. These two are the closest we've gotten to genuine pushback against our cause as the heroes of legend, and all the motive we've heard from them is either, I want to keep my fountain, or the night did it first, it's their fault, so no cigar. Okay, next, let's try the secret bosses. They've gotten a little whisper in their ear from some garbage noise guy, the implications of which I'm going to stay far away from, but at a minimum, it seems to have given them some amount of, like, forbidden knowledge. So let's see what they've handed us. Well, Jevil's sole contribution is something to do with us being trapped and him being free, followed by a cryptic message about how we'll be in the shadow of the night's hand. Not very helpful. Then there's Spamton, who isn't much better, except for the fact that he is, and I'm just, look, trust me when I say he'll be easier to talk about later. For now, just know that he's the one exception when it comes to mentioning heaven, and trust that we'll get to the implications of that later. Oh, and he also name drops the night. There is still one important, well-informed character left, though, and that's Sham. This guy seems like he's been around for a long while, and he's also heard just enough from Jevil to have a lot to say on what's happened to him without himself going as crazy. As such, he's more or less the only non-Ralsei character that seems to be able to have a clear conversation with us about the world of Deltarune. And when we talk to him for the first time in his shop, he has a lot to say. First, He also corroborates how the Darkners used to live in harmony with the Lightners, and elaborates that they looked up to the Lightners as gods and creators until they were eventually abandoned. He also speaks to how the Knight showed up to lock away the other three kings, putting Big Man Spade in charge, such that he could seek his revenge on the Lightners. And lastly, he does refer to us as heroes. In quotes. Note that this isn't just him questioning our abilities. The quotes stay attached to the word whenever we talk to him after beating Jevil. No, it's only when we hit him with a weird legendary and he starts talking about our goal to close the fountain that he first drops this little pinch of smug sarcasm. It's far from a decisive notion, but it comes with this vibe that while we're certainly performing heroics in the short term, we might want to bring a healthy amount of skepticism to how heroic our broader goals might actually be. So okay, let's summarize. What all did those 5 characters just tell us about? Darkness serving Lightners, some crap about heaven, and a rather notable "are you sure about that?" to the notion that we are the heroes of legend, if heroes at all. Plus, I've kind of pulled a fast one on you. I brought up the Knight because all 5 of those 5 characters talked about them, but it turns out that Ralsei hasn't mentioned the Knight once. If you were thrown for a loop earlier when I said that banishing the Angels' Heaven was our ultimate goal, as opposed to stopping the Knight, this would be why, because I kid you not, Ralsei hasn't acknowledged the presence of the Knight once in these first 2 chapters, including every time that they've come up in conversation. It's genuinely disconcerting how much all of these lore-knowledgeable characters' stories seem to line up with each other's without ever even coming close to the prophecy Ralsei has called of this land. If none of the Darkeners actually know about it, then where the hell did this prophecy come from? You see what I'm getting at here, right? The more that I try to disprove the notion that Ralsei is narrating unreliably, the more water the thought seems to hold. Still not proof, but damn it, this shit is off. What was that, Noel? Okay. Hey, by the way, we should totally hang out with Azzy when he gets back from college. Look, I get it. Now would be a great time to invoke Occam's razor, because the simplest answer here is that all of this is a symptom of Deltarune being a video game. If most of the characters have good reason to be ignorant about these super important things, it makes sense for one character to be a well of knowledge for the others to pull from, who saves chunks of information for when it serves the dramatic tension the best. And while there's a case to be made with, oh, it's Toby Fox, the Undertale guy, subverting the medium is his whole MO, it's a case that I'd rather not rely on. Luckily for us, we don't have to, thanks to our friend Susie. Susie made a point throughout Chapter 1 to push back against basically every instance of tropey video gaminess that there is, ditching the party after the first Ralsei cutscene, attacking enemies without giving us, the player, a say in the matter, and last but very much not least, dropping this singular, incredibly insightful piece of wisdom. I can hear you raising your eyebrows at me. You probably think that I'm joking, but I fucking incredibly am not. I can't even begin to tell you how lucky I am to have stumbled across this line, because despite telling us so much about the nature of this game on a meta level, it only shows up if you decide to talk to Ralsei in the middle of a random fuck-ass box-pushing puzzle. Because not only does Susie not know about the button, the fact that she asks who is A means that she doesn't even grasp the nature of what Ralsei's talking about. Notably, Susie's been battling enemies for a while now without batting an eye, and in each of those battles we've been pressing that A button like crazy. So while some of the more gamey things like the concept of battling itself are in one way or another pretty diegetic, button presses and prompts seem to very much not be. So why, pray tell, does Ralsei know so much that he's able to teach us how to play the game from top to bottom? This is a spot where I'd like to name another mild to medium assumption that Ralsei's relationship with the game systems is unique. Because there's a very reasonable case to be made that the Darkeners can inherently understand the game's systems. Lancer mentions a button press on a sign early on in Chapter 1, as does Susie Master, the weird puzzle guy. These are normal-ass, not crazy Darkeners saying these things, and especially for the latter, I struggle to see a justification that it somehow got passed down from Ralsei. Because of that, I can't argue this on the assumption that he and he alone is able to know what he does about the systems. I can only argue that the amount of knowledge he holds is unique. For now it is. He takes the cake by a landslide when it comes to the pure number of interactions that he's been able to tell us about, and he also actually corrects the masters on several occasions. If Ralsei continues to understand how the non-diegetic game systems work to a degree that's magnitudes greater than every other character in the game, the implication is that those systems aren't really something that the characters can intuit, and that there's something beyond plot contrivance that's leading him to be this equipped. But if a new character shows up in the coming chapters who does happen to rival Ralsei's understanding of the game systems, then this particular Jenga block is going to get looser. The precedent for other characters understanding small bits of the game systems does exist, and so there's not much in the way of it showing up in larger doses. So with that, I am now openly acknowledging that where we are now marks the beginning of our descent from clear-cut evidence-based analysis into proper conspiracy theory conclusion jumping bullshit. Because there are some things that suggest that his knowledge extends beyond button presses, if not that his relationship with the game systems extends beyond knowledge entirely. First off, there are these two moments where he explicitly tells us out loud to imagine what Susie is doing, before our camera suddenly shifts over to actually eavesdrop on what she's actually saying completely separately from Chris. It's hard to say what degree he's causing this to happen, but he does seem to know very clearly that our perspective can shift like this, and seems to be teeing it up to happen on both occasions. He's actually so cognizant of when this thing should happen that when it doesn't on the Snowgrave route, he's genuinely shocked. And he seems to tease the boundaries of the game's usual presentation in a number of other places too, like how when we first meet him, his lines manage to escape the default text box as he's tossing out some familiar legendary language. It's in this moment that I'd like to remind you, the only time we've gotten full-on lore cutscenes has been when Ralsei is telling us one of his big unconfirmed stories. The only other time anything has gotten close to this level of visual backed exposition is when Queen talks about the night, but she's still confined to speak from the text box, and her visuals seem to be the same floating displays she's been using to speak to us for the whole chapter. Meanwhile, with Ralsei, our entire screen is being taken over, and it's being taken over as a way to supplement ideas that, for all we know right now, could very much just be a pair of tall-ass tails. And so while yes, we can't prove that this implies anything about Ralsei's relationship with the game, we also can't disprove those potential implications either. Can we really say with confidence that these cutscenes are just cutscenes when we're already assuming that other ways Ralsei interacts with us, the player, are more than just plot contrivance? If he has the capacity to influence who the game's camera is looking at, then who's to say he lacks the capacity to influence something more substantial? It'd be a leap and a half to consider this all that plausible, but it's very much possible that these cutscenes could be something that he's creating himself to sell his stories. I think what really sells me on this particular thought, way more than the barely there explicit evidence, is the content of the roaring cutscene specifically, as he only integrates the notion that Darkners turn to statues after he knows that we've seen it happen. Mentioning specifically how they get Medusified feels oddly specific when put up against the vague wording of everything else in these cutscenes. He could have left it at the surviving Darkners getting crushed by the darkness, and the shoe would have fit, but since several of our friends are statues in this moment, he knew that that specific worry was very much on our minds. And so to me, it a little bit feels like something that he just threw in there. As such, even if it turns out that Ralsei isn't explicitly aware that we the player are seeing these cutscenes, I'm still very, very wary of the thought that they're intended to embody a kind of prophetic charisma that he seems to have by legitimizing his words through pomp and circumstance. Okay, but there's still a core issue that kind of takes the bite out of all of this talk, and that's that we don't have any idea why he'd do all of this. We're seeing all the symptoms of an ulterior motive, sure, but we're also seeing symptoms of a bunch of other things too. Like the elephant in the room, how consistently nice he is. It's a very naive, black and white kind of kindness too, to the point where it almost cripples the notion that he's capable of being manipulative. The motherfucker practically feels like he was born yesterday. What with the lack of friends, lack of subjects, lack of the specific example here that really gets to me on this front is how he goes out of his way to heal King Chaos when we're about to defeat him. That alone is such an intensely magnanimous move that is genuinely hard for me to suggest it could be anything but genuine naivete. Is that how you pronounce that word? It genuinely looks like his conviction to winning everyone over with kindness is an unwavering one, even when it's for someone who would prefer to flat out refuse it. And I don't feel confident that anything else that he's done that might suggest it to be an act could even hold a candle to that genuine moment. Maybe we could wave it away as some part of his longer-term goal requiring him to forgive and forget on principle, and like, I could wager a couple decent guesses as to why that might be, but it'd still be a big-ass assumption, no? Like, surely I don't think he's evil or anything, right? Well, look, if you didn't realize it already, for a hot minute now, this train's been considering its rails a suggestion. So I'm gonna go ahead and flip the script a little bit. I'm gonna give you a potential further conclusion before I justify it, largely because it's almost definitely not true. But with that said, the things that I explored within this idea allowed me to connect the dots on a pattern of behavior that Ralsei is doing throughout all of Deltarune. So even if the things that I'm about to mention almost definitively aren't going to turn out true, the fact that it kind of works speaks volumes. Hey, remember how in the intro I called the pieces missing from Ralsei's story suspiciously heart-shaped? Weren't we just talking about how Ralsei seems to be able to understand and influence the game's systems at a higher level than everyone else other than us? What is it again that diegetically connects us and the game's systems that we've interacted with to the actual world of Deltarune? Because I've looked through the dialogue and it turns out that Ralsei, with one exception, is the only character in the game to have mentioned our soul by name. So like, what if Ralsei also has a soul? More specifically, what if he's possessed ASRIEL using a soul in a similar fashion to how we've possessed Chris? Okay, so I can hear the fight or flight response from the other side of the screen, so let's address some questions. One, first and foremost, isn't Ralsei's whole deal wanting to close the fountains using our soul? Why not just use his own? And to that, I say that you found the source of the problem. I don't have any fabulous answers to reconcile with the logical inconsistencies on this one, especially since we're getting into lore-heavy mechanics. I don't even think that there's any reliable evidence that a multiplicity of souls exist in Deltarune's world. So, two, if he's actually in ASRIEL's body, how has no one recognized him as ASRIEL yet? Well, Susie's implied to be bouncing from school to school a lot, so she's new in town. New enough, presumably, that she wasn't around before he left for college. And Chris is a little, occupied. Turns out the only person who knew ASRIEL pretty well before he went to college, who also has interacted with Ralsei properly, is Noelle. And she does notice she just pretty quickly finds herself rather preoccupied as well. Still, you could argue that this isn't enough, that Noelle would have reacted more, or Chris would have reacted through our control. And then three, is it really all that likely that Toby Fox would have the raw cojones to shove doubly possessed step-siblings Chris and Azzy into a tunnel of love to make them both unwillingly flirt with each other? So like, yeah, there's clearly a lot of shit that we've got to wade through to work with this particular theory. This is wholeheartedly a conclusion that requires jumping to. But if you can discount all of said shit and stay with me for a moment, there's still a good deal of stuff left that suggests that Ralsei isn't just a Darkner and that ASRIEL is involved. There are a bunch of subtle things, like how so many of the important Darkners from separate worlds seem to remember interacting with each other prior to the fountains opening, while it feels like Ralsei low-key just spawned in when we, the player, did. Then there are the character tea items, which, if you didn't know, heal different values depending on how much the character drinking it likes the other character, with unique dialogue to match. When Chris drinks Susie's tea, they seam into it and heal for 120 HP, which is the default for a cut and dry friendship. But when Chris drinks Ralsei's tea, it only heals for 60, despite Susie having openly done way worse things to Chris than anything Ralsei has, and the dialogue seems to suggest that Ralsei's happy because Chris didn't react to it. And also, while I still don't like relying on Undertale lore to bridge the gaps in our understanding of Deltarune, in Undertale, ASRIEL is more or less the soul guy. But once again, I find myself coming back to this moment where Ralsei pressures us into suppressing our feelings and not thinking about whatever it is we just fought because of who it is we were fighting. That's right, it's finally time to talk about goddamn Spamton. Do you remember how earlier I said that Spamton's the only character other than Ralsei that's mentioned heaven? Well, it turns out that he mentions heaven a lot, and almost always in reference to one thing in particular, Neo. Neo, of course, is originally from Undertale as Mettaton Neo, and this fact breaks a huge pattern in Deltarune, because Neo is the first thing we found in a dark world to have originated from Undertale. Note that I consider this pretty different from the times I've brought up Undertale previously in this video, because this isn't relying on story beats or character traits from Undertale here. Because think about it, every character that comes from Undertale is just a normal-ass person hanging out around hometown, and every Dark World character we've met so far has been entirely new to us. In fact, fact, even Mettaton himself, or more accurately the ghost that possessed Mettaton, who's often referred to as Hapstabluk, is also just a character in Hometown, implied to be living with his brother Napstabluk. As it stands, Neo is the only exception to this rule, and that's if it's even an exception at all, because for all we know, it could just be a light world thing that happens to be in the dark world, like Chris and Susie are. And somehow it seems like Spamton's come to a similar conclusion. Darkners can't leave light worlds, but Lightners can. And so when he refers to Neo as heaven-piercing, it sounds like he's implying that it can actually travel to the light world. After all, the light world is the light world, and something we have to ascend to get to. It makes sense that from a Darkner's perspective, the shit basically just is heaven. He then immediately follows the notion by saying it's designed by the classics you've come to expect, and that, crazy as the implications might be, sounds like a quirky, largely unintelligible way to say that it's from Undertale. It seems weirdly clairvoyant, and this theoretical clairvoyance causes all the weird things that he says about grabbing life by the silly strings and becoming a big shot to start to imply something way more specific, because loading himself into Neo and in turn possessing something from the light world sounds like a pretty plausible way to actually let him leave the dark world. In turn, when we finally do load him into Neo, everything he says seems to corroborate that that was his plan. Just a plan that simply didn't work. Despite his new body, he still can't leave the dark world. And if we talk to Swatch in his shop in Pandora Palace, he explains that Neo is an exception to that Undertale light world pattern. Alongside all the other dark world objects, the Neo in Queen's basement is just a fantastical manifestation of an innocuous, inanimate thing from the light world. In this case, a drawing. Turns out it was actually something that Hapstabluk drew in the art program that Swatch represents back before the library's computer room turned into a dark world. After Spamton realizes that his plan failed, he turns on Chris, and it's for another shockingly clairvoyant reason. Remember how I also said earlier that only one character other than Ralsei is mentioned or sold by name? That character is none other than everybody's favorite #1 rated salesman, 1997. And with that particular piece of forbidden knowledge, he seems to recognize the fact that we, the player, have managed to successfully possess a body from the light world. Chris will allow him to stand so tall he'll see past the dark, to stand up with his head in the clouds and look up into heaven. He just needs the thing that we've been using to possess Chris. That little soul they have. It's at this moment that Ralsei and Susie show up to help, and as the cherry on top to feed my silly little delusions, he refers to the three of us as souls, plural, as if there are suddenly multiple to choose from. It might be a bit of a tall order to ask you to bring your thoughts back around to our favorite fluffed up white boy again after all of that, but isn't it kind of suspicious that Ralsei, this champion of letting your emotions fly, who's been insistent on providing us, the player, with our own choices at every turn, just so happens to decide to draw the line at a Darkner who's trying to possess a Lightner via their soul? Look, you're entirely welcome to still consider this Ralsei is controlling ASRIEL theory of mine complete bullshit in terms of the canon proper, but like, even just as fanon, I fear it has some compelling ass legs. Namely, it gives us a good reason to why Ralsei has insisted on doting so much on us, the player specifically, because we are controlling Chris in the exact same way that he's controlling ASRIEL. And for that matter, the concept gives Chris himself an actual clear motive. If you see your brother acting quite different from his usual self, using a different name, and acting like he's never met you, it wouldn't take much to think that someone has possessed him, and you probably would do things that directly oppose whatever that possessor is planning to do with him. And yeah, the man's tea would probably taste pretty damn bad. But like I've been implying, the point of this video isn't to convince you that Ralsei is using a soul to control ASRIEL. I still wouldn't even say that it's necessarily to convince you that Ralsei is acting in bad faith. It's to show you how this line of investigation brought a core theme of the game full circle for me. Tucked within all the ideas that I've explored in this video so far, there's one singular thing that I think Ralsei has been definitively doing, regardless as to what his intentions might be. He's trying to control the narrative around who has agency in Deltarune. Agency has obviously been a theme from moment one in this game, what with the whole 1-2 punch of no one can choose who they are in this world, followed by if you haven't gotten it by now, your choices don't matter. It's a super striking image to paint in our head, beyond the obvious boundary it's setting with Undertale fans, thanks to the implication that the player is a passive observer in the narrative, regardless of the various pieces of interactivity that this game has. But it wasn't until I was faced with the notion of Ralsei possessing ASRIEL, and thus entirely removing his agency like we are with Chris, that I started to connect the dots on how Despite everything, Ralsei seems to be controlling the agency of those around him more successfully than any of the other characters. Hiding information and lying by omission leads the characters to be less capable of making well-informed decisions on their own. Instead, they have to rely on him to make those decisions for them, in turn waiting to reveal supposedly important information until the characters start to make decisions informed by other sources causes them to question their ability to judge their own decisions, and once again rely on him to make those decisions for them. Of course, Ralsei has been very insistent on telling us, the player, that our choices do matter. Even when trying to encourage us not to kill enemies at the beginning of the game, he still insists that it's up to us what happens, a pattern of behavior that regularly leads to friction with Susie, who, despite being the second punch in the game's anti-agency intro, turns out to be the character who makes her own decisions the most. In turn, a pervasive dichotomy spawns, Ralsei asking us to choose things and Susie disagreeing with those choices, and it shows up all throughout chapters 1 and 2 and won't be stopping anytime soon as we continue into chapter 3. It feels like if Susie spent the whole game following Ralsei's whims, she wouldn't have made any decisions at all. But despite her complaints that Chris is getting too much attention, Ralsei continues to insist on providing us with the power to decide. It's no coincidence that this game has been so focused on Susie leaving the party and doing her own thing, and she's far from the only character who demonstrates an ability to make decisions for themselves. It's a simple cause and effect. Every time Ralsei gives us more agency, he's implicitly taking it away from the other characters in the game. But it doesn't stop there, because the agency that Ralsei gives us, the player, is a lot more pretense than substance. Naming us the leader of the party for all the minute decisions and combat encounters placates our desire for interactivity, and leads us to not even think about whether or not a choice should exist in moments where we're about to do something of significance. And in turn, it starts to feel like all the ways that he alone leans into plot contrivance and fuzzily diegetic tutorials are meant to make us believe that this is just a video game, that the agency of in-game characters is secondary to ours, even though those characters regularly try to make their own decisions and refuse our control. It really truly feels like at almost every turn in the road, Ralsei is quite literally delegating the collective agency of the Lightners and hiding it behind a meek little healer who's just here to support his new friends. Then there's Spamton, who, regardless of the horrors he'd caused with just a crumb of freedom, only wanted to be a real boy at the end of the day. He wanted to escape the confines of the Dark World and his supposed fate as a Darkner to serve the Lightners, to finally earn himself proper agency over his own life. And out of all the supposedly evil and ill-willed characters we've come across in these first 2 chapters, only one has led Ralsei to insist we stop thinking about them, the one who dared to seek out a life beyond what had been laid out for him. Because if we started to think about it too much, we might start to seek out a path beyond what he's laid out for us. With all of these instances of Ralsei controlling the agency of the people around him brought to light, one final example starts to stand out among the rest. His 2 completely unverified, unfalsifiable tales of legend that slot in neatly alongside all the other video gamey cliches he's been peddling, flush with world-ending stakes that only he can speak to, and the implied inevitability of both Chris and Susie following it exactly as it's been foretold. What else could keep our agency at bay better than a really good prophecy? Earlier I asked a question of whether or not I thought Ralsei is evil, and while I do have my hopes for what will turn out to be true, I plain and simply don't have an answer. There's a whole spectrum of possible intent that I'm not going to be able to scrutinize from his actions alone, but I definitely don't think that any amount of good intentions are going to completely absolve him of all these weird ways that he's tried to exercise control over the people around him. In the simplest, least twisty version of his remaining story, in which Ralsei does turn out to have entirely good intentions, he was still so consistently fudging the numbers in his favor in these first 2 chapters that it's already started to affect the people around him, however subtly, and chances are it'll continue to do so. And such a prospect implies that if all the other characters were to actually grasp the full story and form their own opinions on it, the things that they would actually authentically decide to do with the agency that provides them would fundamentally differ from what Ralsei wants from them. And that's scary, because it means that we're flying blind, unknowingly complacent to something of substance that he thinks we will take issue with. But it also means that we're in for a wild, wild ride with this story, because this core theme of lacking agency, the theme that formed the whole 1-2 punch hook of this game, of life forcing you into boxes and you fighting your way out of them, is one that exists demonstrably in even the most outwardly innocuous parts of this game. If even our favorite fluffed up white boy has sank his claws this deep into this theme at the core of the story, then when it comes time for our favorite characters to finally properly take back their agency from him in ways that truly matter, well, I imagine it'll feel a lot like standing up with our heads in the clouds, looking into heaven.
Holy shit, I cannot wait for Ezzy to get back from college.
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please like and subscribe. Also, look forward to more videos from me, hopefully. Probably not on Deltarune. If we can get this video to 100,000 likes, I will kill him.